They say when partners offered knowledge, help, and encouragement without responsiveness, breastfeeding duration actually decreased. Okay, so again, traditional measures of social support would have considered those good, and they would have been puzzled by this finding. Okay, but they said with responsiveness, the women felt understood and cared for. But without it, practical support meant they were not self-sufficient. In other words, somebody's trying to do it for them. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This is the Science Chick Report, and I'm Dr. Kathleen Kendall-Tackett. So this is the second in our little triptych of a podcast where we're going to look at the topic of social support. Now, here I'm going to look specifically at social support around breastfeeding, but we're going to talk about kind of what does that mean generally. Because again, so many studies, starting back with when I first started looking at this in the late 80s, people were saying, oh yeah, you need social support. But then you say, okay, what does that mean? How do you describe that? And so it was something that people kind of really wondered about. What is social support? And also, how can we provide it? Because again, I think that's the thing most of us want to provide. Otherwise, why waste our time? And so we want to be effective at this. But I'm going to kind of show you, there's kind of a little bit of nuance here that might not necessarily be apparent. And it wasn't apparent to researchers for a long time, but now it is. And actually, I think they're getting more accurate and more reliable results that they've acknowledged that. Okay, so what is support? Now, that's something that seems like it's pretty straightforward, but what is it? Okay, so the way it kind of comes down in the literature is like for many years, we just looked at the supportive action. So let's say I come over and clean your house. That would be considered support. That I came in and I provided some physical support for you. And then I did some, you did your laundry or, loaded your dishwasher or whatever. Okay. But do I perceive this as support? The person who is receiving it, did they experience that as support? And I think that's where the key distinction is. Okay. Because you can do something that's even well-meaning. But if you're not kind of thinking about what the person needs, it actually can be counterproductive. One book, if you haven't ever read this, I would recommend it. It's called When Helping Hurts. And that's actually a fascinating book because it was talking about something completely different. It was like poverty eradication efforts in developing countries. And what they would find is sometimes people would come in feeling all sort of full of this idea of, they're going to do this great thing for this village. And they wouldn't ask the people in the village, okay, what do you need? They'd say, okay, what you need is this. And so then, they put in a well or something. Now, to you and I, that sounds like a really good thing. But to the village, it wasn't particularly helpful. And they would come back later and find it all silted up. Okay. And, like there was this one village, I think the army did this when we were first in Afghanistan. And they were finding these wells were getting filled back in. Well, they found out that for the women, that was the only way they got a chance to go and be with each other. In that very oppressive culture, that they had a chance going and getting water was a way that they could socialize. So again, we really kind of be needing to think about what does this person need, and then work from there, rather than thinking about what I think I need to tell them. Okay, but what it really comes down to is this. Even if well-intentioned, even if it worked for other people, if the mother does not think it's support, it's not support. Not support for her. And what we have to do is try not to get ego about that because it's hard. We offer something in kind of good faith and, mom doesn't think it's supportive, and that can be hard, honestly. But just keep in mind that right now that the focus is her and what she needs. Okay, so what are some sources of social support? Okay, well, long recognized in the breastfeeding world, partners are the biggest source of support for breastfeeding. Okay, so when you look at how well women fare with breastfeeding, partner support was usually the number one thing that was there. And if it was there and if it was effective, that made all the difference. Okay, the grandmothers, honestly, that's a little more of a mixed bag. Okay, other relatives, this could be in-laws, this could be Uncle Frank, who everybody thinks is a creep. I mean, there could be a lot of people that could kind of come in that, again, are not being very helpful. Lactation consultants, kind of mixed reports on this. And again, very often, people are really trying to do the best thing, but they are often in a situation where they are asked to cover way too many beds and yet, provide care. It could be really tricky. Peer support, again, sometimes can be great, sometimes not great. And also healthcare providers. I think we're well aware of what healthcare providers can do well and not so well. Okay, so let's take a look at, first of all, this review of 8 studies on partner support. And I thought this was actually really an interesting one. And it said here that this is kind of what they concluded. They said, when partners offered help and encouragement, breastfeeding initiation rates increased. But that sometimes help and encouragement, and they put that in quotes, was negative. Okay, so you'd think, well, how could help and encouragement be negative? Well, we'll see how. Okay, so what they found, and this is an interesting kind of response, they said that the most important type of support was something they called responsiveness. Okay, so in other words, you paying attention to what does this mother need? Okay, so sensitive to her needs, it respects her decisions and it promotes self-efficacy. So it's not like, kind of helping her to the point where they can't do it themselves. What we always want to move it toward is that they can do it themselves. So you're being sensitive to their needs too. You want to find out what's important here for you. What is it that you're trying to accomplish? What decisions have you made about this? And again, there's times we can do some education and stuff because sometimes people kind of have some ideas that maybe aren't entirely accurate in terms of what we know, but always we got to come back to this. And it's kind of interesting because when you look at the IBCLC exam, there's a lot of questions like this. They'll give you a case and they'll say, what would you do first? And the correct answer invariably is support the mother. Okay. That's spot on from what this study found. Okay. But also they said that it was really particularly effective when women and their partners work together as a team. And they said that that was really good. And what's kind of interesting is like during COVID, I had some lactation consultants say, yeah, one of the things that they thought was really interesting is since they had to do everything virtually, it brought the husband or partner in as a team member. Okay, so they weren't just sort of relegated off to the side. They were actually in there helping. And lactation consultant might say, hey, listen, can you hold that phone so I can see, such and such, or can you do this? And bringing the partner in. And they said this was kind of an unexpected benefit that they didn't expect to find. Okay, so finding that the women and the partners was the team, that was the time that worked the most effective. And it increased the big 3 that we always look for: initiation, duration, and exclusivity. Okay, so this is what they said. They said when partners offered knowledge, help, and encouragement without responsiveness, breastfeeding duration actually decreased. Okay, so again, traditional measures of social support would have considered those good, and they would have been puzzled by this finding. Okay, but they said with responsiveness, the women felt understood and cared for. But without it, practical support meant they were not self-sufficient. In other words, somebody's trying to do it for them. Okay, and encouragement felt like coercion to either breastfeed or to meet impossible goals. Okay, so again, you get this idea that paying attention to what the mother wants. And I think sometimes we kind of come in with an agenda, as healthcare providers. And it's important that we put that aside if we're really going to be effective, which I think most of us want to be. Okay, but they said when the woman and her partner work together as a breastfeeding team, effective supportive behaviors are more likely to occur and result in improved autonomy and self-efficacy of mothers and their partners, as well as improved breastfeeding outcomes. Teamwork may therefore be the core aspect of responsive breastfeeding support, reflecting a key element of effective social support evident within the sociological literature. So again, this idea that encouraging them to be a team, but also listening to what the mother wants to do. Okay, now this is another one. This one came from the UK as well. And I thought this was interesting because they didn't assign groups to this. These are groups that these families naturally drifted into. Okay, so they looked at basically 3 groups of mothers, and, anybody who was in their orbit. Okay, and looked at kind of different levels of support. Okay, so the first is what they called extensive support. Now, this would be, in my opinion, the ideal situation. So it was support from partners, their mothers, friends, and health professionals. Okay, and only the mothers fed the babies. Okay, that's going to be an important distinction. Now, family support was considered sort of the mid-tier. Okay, and that was both partners and their mothers. So partners and the grandmothers were being there as supporters. Okay, so not as big of a network, but still 2 people. But here's the distinction. The partners and the grandmothers fed the baby. Okay, and to me, this is a little bit scary because when, like working in the postpartum depression world, this is actually advice that mothers get. Have somebody else feed the baby. Have somebody else do the nighttime feeds. And it's kind of like, if you do that, there's going to be a result from that you're probably not going to like. Okay, so that's just important. And again, it's the mother's choice here, what she wants to do. But oftentimes, I think it works against what she wants to do. Okay, so we'll get back to that in just a second. And then, quote unquote, low support. I think this is the situation for probably the majority of mothers, which is just the partner. Okay, the mothers fed their babies. Okay, at 2 months, now this was kind of interesting. Extensive support. Now, again, this is the old, it takes a village. They got it from the healthcare providers, from the friends, from the grandma, from the partners. 94% were still breastfeeding. Okay, so no mystery here about what type of support is necessary and what type of support is best. Now, what's interesting is the next group was the low support group, and 48% of them were still breastfeeding. Okay, so now 48% is a lot lower than 94%. It's, it's about a little more than half, so not outstanding, but compare it to this one that has the family support, only 13% were still breastfeeding. Okay, so again, when you provide support by having others feed the baby, breastfeeding rates plummet, just plummet. It is important that the mother be the one to feed the baby, period. So again, the low support kind of definitely moving in the right direction. But obviously, wouldn't it be great if all of our mothers had that extensive support? And we know that, this tells us it does make a difference. Okay, so looking at a review of 27 studies of father support for breastfeeding. Now, what was kind of interesting is these guys tried to kind of capture what the fathers were thinking about in terms of providing breastfeeding support. Okay, we know that they're important, but they said that they were more negative about breastfeeding when they felt helpless, anxious, guilty, and unable to help their partners overcome difficulties. And this is hard. I've worked with some, friends of mine, male friends, who actually have had wife going through breastfeeding difficulties, and as a lactation consultant, I can't help but jump in. But, you get this idea that, yeah, they're unable to help their partners, but they also felt that they had few opportunities to bond. See, and this is when a lot of times fathers will start trying to really push to feed the baby. And we saw where that ends. Okay. And again, I said, if that's okay with the mother, that can be an okay ending. But I think many of these mothers who start kind of want to continue a little past the first few weeks. Okay. But they also felt invisible in the antenatal closet. Again, that's something really we should be conscious of, in our interactions with families. Okay. So what can we do? How can we provide some support? So I just want to give some examples. Okay. So what can partners do? Well, partners are still in left brain mode, which is what the world seems to operate in. So they can be the ones that, take notes when you see the lactation consultant or healthcare provider. Being that extra set of hands is really important in the beginning. Give mom the quick break so she can take a shower, a quick nap. Very important, screening visitors and calls, get away those unhelpful people, the ones that stand over and say, "Didn't he just eat? Are you sure you have enough milk?" Okay, that's not helpful. And so that kind of thing you don't necessarily want around. Protecting the mother from unhelpful advice, but also too, learning the signs of when the baby's getting enough to eat and kind of repeating that back to moms. Because I've had moms who've had so much milk. I mean, they've had this gigantic milk supply. I mean, enough to sit down with a hand battery operated pump and fill up a 4-ounce bottle and fill up another 4-ounce bottle on the other side at 3 weeks postpartum. And then seriously ask if they've got enough milk. So that perception is sometimes kind of hard. But if you've got somebody who can stand there objectively and say, yeah, this is how I know, okay, because you're seeing this and this and this, baby's weight gain is good, the baby looks healthy, the baby is, is responsive, there's poopy diapers, run through the list, and be that objective voice, I think could be super helpful. Okay. And also too, they can bond with their babies in other ways besides feeding. And we're going to talk about this in kind of the third session. Infant baby wearing, you can, do skin to skin contact. There's infant massage is another great way to do it. So there's lots of other things to do, besides just feeding the baby, and eventually, there'll be times to feed the baby. But right in this beginning, we want to kind of get this going if we can. Okay, what about grandmas? Well, again, they can be a great source of support, but, I think the urge is to sometimes take over and do it the way you did it. And, some moms do not get support from their own mothers. It's not uncommon. Partly because, you're making different parenting choices. Maybe your mom didn't feed the baby like this. And so then they're thinking that you're criticizing them. Mothers may not understand how it works or the information's out of date, even if they breastfed. Like if you learned breastfeeding in the 70s, you may have a different set of advice. The whole roughing up your nipples with a terry cloth towel. We had a book where the author was suggesting that. And it's kind of like, oh, we don't recommend that anymore. So breastfeeding doesn't change, but what we know about it does. Okay. And again, the information may not be helpful, but it might be helpful. And also, too, if a mom is, watching her daughter struggle with pain and it's just so horrible for them and she's getting anxiety, she may be really concerned about that and saying, I'm not sure this is worth it for you to go through this. And I think that comes from usually a genuine place of concern. But that may be a thing of why they want to tell them stop. Now, what I'd like to do in the ideal situation is let's address whatever problem there is going on. But I understand kind of why they might say that. And unfortunately, if their relationship was difficult, it's probably going to be more likely to be that now. Okay, but if we get grandmas on board, moms are more likely to continue, especially if grandmas are the primary sources of support, which in some communities they are. Okay, so what about the mother-to-mother support organizations? Well, peer supporters, for the most part, have fantastic results. Again, not every mother and every peer supporter get on, but for the most part, this has been a super effective movement. So either through WIC or through organizations like Lactation, and other breastfeeding organizations, peer supporters can be life-saving, can be a source of lifelong friends. Many, mothers I know that are still friends with people that they knew when their kids were little. But it can be, as I call mom petition, when you just compete about the stupidest stuff. My baby sleeps through the night already. You really have almost no say about that. Much of that is governed by your breast storage capacity. How much milk-making tissue do you have in your breast? If you have a lot of breast storage capacity, your baby sleeps through the night earlier. Okay? It's not because of some marvelous parenting you're doing. It's kind of like bragging that you have blue eyes. You have literally no control over that. Mothers can't change the breast storage capacity very much. You can change it a little bit. Okay? But it's just competition about crazy stuff. The fact is, these kids will get there. We need to kind of get everybody focusing on their baby, their journey, and not looking at everybody else. And again, so if there's somebody who's facilitating the group, we want to kind of steer the group in a little more positive direction. And sometimes, unpleasant comments. I mean, I experienced a lot of these myself as a new mom. I would never let my child ... For this reason, I think many mothers prefer the drop-in clinics. I think they've become more popular. And they still get support, but, it might not be the same kind of relational. But, I'd say try a few different things because, you might find some groups are great and some groups are not a good match. I remember reading a story one time about this mom and, in her early week, she was in a breastfeeding support group and it was so fantastic. Then she went back to work. The other mothers were not very understanding of that. And she said it did definitely change your relationship with that group. So again, sometimes, these groups are good for a season, but not necessarily for the entire journey. Social media, be careful. Oof, this can be a lifeline, and it absolutely can be, especially if you live in an area that's rural, and you have something, especially something really kind of unique. You might have had, say, HELP syndrome or something, and just to talk to somebody else who went through that. Or I remember a mom I interviewed for my first book, and she was saying, God, I just wanted to meet somebody who'd had general anesthesia during birth, and so there can be times when this can be super helpful. And just sometimes even just listening to the chatter, that can be helpful, but may not be the safest places. Okay. So your curated groups are definitely the safer of the ones, but some of these can be really quite vicious. I had two young colleagues, both of them were thinking about becoming IBCLCs, and both got absolutely zinged on social media pages and both completely got out of the field. So these are people that spend a lot of time on social media, and yet, man, so I would say approach with caution and say buyer beware, but also to being careful about limiting phone time. That's important. Okay, so lactation consultants. Now, this is hard because lactation consultants are often put in impossible situations, and especially, if like you're way understaffed, which you often are. A mom can come in over the weekend, give birth, be discharged, and never see somebody. So, and even though times they did, the lactation consultants came through on basically a drive-by, and that was it. So they didn't necessarily always rate them as particularly effective, but some actually had fantastic experience. Okay, so again, this is something I think that Jack Newman has said over and over and over again, and I think this is really important. He said, if everybody who came in contact with a mother and a baby could evaluate the latch and whether the baby is drinking at the breast, he said, I think we would avert so many tragedies. I think he's right, because I think oftentimes that's never evaluated. Okay. And this is all the times down to a staffing issue. And so to just go back to the recommendations of one full-time equivalent for every 783 births. So like if you're at a hospital and there's 2,000 or 3,000 births, and you're the only one, but we a lot of times feel like, well, we're kind of pleading for an invitation to the party. So we don't want to rock the boat. And so, lactation consultants are often put in an impossible situation, and in terms of admits, it should be 235 admits for one full-time equivalent. And for the outpatient clinic, it should be this. So you get an idea that, many situations are dramatically understaffed. Okay, healthcare providers, this one's tricky. And again, a lot of times healthcare provider advice is based on their own personal experience or experience of friends. They don't learn this in school. I've actually taught residents, and what they know is pretty close to nothing. But, if you kind of approach it with, okay, look, I'd like to teach you a couple things to look for and know where to send to people, and that's kind of my advice to them. So, healthcare providers, a lot of times they may mouth all the right things, but when it comes right down to it, they give terrible advice, absolutely terrible, and this is so hard. You just listen to what people say and you think, oh my God, that's not even close to what we would normally say. Okay. But they don't have a training in it, but oftentimes they're expected to know, so they're in a tough position. Okay. But you have some providers who just have such a negative view about it. They don't even think it's possible. And I thought this study by Lori Feldman Winter was kind of scary. It was a survey of pediatricians, and they did it first in 1995 and then in 2016. And they found that the number of pediatricians who thought breastfeeding could actually work and was possible had gone down significantly in that time. And they said about only 47% referred mothers to other sources of community support. So again, they don't know anything. They have a negative attitude about it, and also too, they don't refer out. And that's too bad, but again, looking at this, you think, oh my gosh, this is terrible. This is absolutely terrible. And it is. But remember, we talked about how you're in that right brain and you're really good at reading social cues. Even if they don't say negative things, you can a lot of times pick up on the vibe. And which is, okay, well, we'll go ahead and give us a try. Or, here, just take this just in case. Here's some nice, formula, or here's a coupon, or they'll give you some educational materials from the formula companies, things that are kind of not cool. But again, it's kind of a problem. So here's, what I consider an ideal situation. Healthcare provider has training in breastfeeding and is an IBCLC. Okay. And again, like I said, especially for a physician, oftentimes they don't necessarily have the time, but they know enough to know what's necessary. Okay. And sometimes people specialize in really tricky situations. Okay. Or the healthcare provider realizes what they don't know. This is, I think, the next best. But they have like a lactation consultant in the office, or they'll refer to somebody in the community. So again, identify and send out. Because, like if somebody comes in with a problem and every answer is formula, that's not really being supportive. Worst case, healthcare provider knows nothing about breastfeeding, but believes they do. That's bad. Okay. And what they do know comes from formula companies. So this is a red flag. If you go in and you see a bunch of, formula company adverts, do not get your advice from them. Okay. And again, formula is the answer to everything. Because again, the idea is you don't want to let the baby starve and be in these situations. And the idea that sometimes people have put forward, the lactation consultants are willing to let babies starve to just kind of get to this is absurd. Rule number one is feed the baby. You feed the baby, and then we figure out what's going on. So it's just nonsense. Probably a lot of you saw that Law and Order episode years ago. Well, this is the baby-friendly contract we signed. What? Anyway, somebody who obviously had a bad experience and, was influential enough because they wrote a script. Okay, so what could work? This is actually what I ended up kind of doing. Had a healthcare provider who was really good in other areas. He was an excellent pediatrician, but he was, old school. And I just knew not to get breastfeeding advice from him. If I was having a problem, I went and asked somebody at League who didn't ask him because he didn't know. And so sometimes he'd try to tell me and I'd say, and he'd go, yeah, sorry. Okay, I forgot. So, but that worked actually really well. And we stayed with him until he retired. Okay, so finding a breastfeeding supporter, just kind of a couple of things. The credentials are important, but not the only thing, obviously. Having a bunch of letters behind your name doesn't necessarily mean you have any clinical skills. In fact, oftentimes the more letters, the fewer your clinical skills. I have found sometimes some of the best people, the best clinicians are volunteers who've had years of experience and are just so kind, that, yeah, they're fantastic. I think the most important thing is that the mother should feel heard and validated. And remember, too, even excellent clinicians are not going to necessarily be right for every mother. That's just kind of reality. Okay, so what support could look like? This is a mom when I was collecting some stories from moms. She told me this. She said, you hear about all the problems with breastfeeding, but what they don't tell you about is how nice it is. It's like you're in your own little love bubble. I thought that was just adorable. But, we want to have breastfeeding to be pain-free. We don't want this, choking through 6 weeks of painful breastfeeding. That's just absurd. We want them to know, to be confident about this, that their babies are getting enough to eat and what to do if they're not, and to feel in control and that they can overcome obstacles. Okay, so that is basically how do we foster self-efficacy? And we do that with starting with listening to the mother. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this session and then we're going to move on and we're going to talk about the situations about when breastfeeding does not work and what else can you do. And so I will see you in a few minutes or later, depending on when this thing gets posted. I want to say thank you for attending today and I hope you come back for session 3. See you soon.